Did you ever think that the former Soviet Union would be linked, even remotely, to the return of Christ? Well, if your answer is a resounding no, the man you see on your screen could perhaps shock you. Still wondering why? We'll explain. Meet Sergei Torop, a former traffic policeman turned self-proclaimed messiah. Belonging to the small Russian town of Minusins, Torop was born in the early 1960s in Soviet Russia. However, not much is known about his life before his spiritual awakening. In 1989, Torop was purportedly fired from his job, then went on to make a bizarre claim of receiving a special revelation. The ex-traffic cop chalked up the claim of being the reincarnation of Jesus from Nazareth. There is a very fine line between being a law enforcement official in a corner of Russia and claiming to be Jesus reincarnate, one that is seldom crossed. But Torop managed to do it. And so as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a new religious order was rising somewhere in Russia. In this episode of HT In Depth, we take you through the history of Sergei Torop, a Russian man who enthralled thousands with his religious cult and now has been sentenced to 12 years in prison. The world isn't a stranger to self-styled mystics and godmen. These individuals are often infamous for their cults and their ability to amass thousands of followers. However, more often than not, these mystics are found to be in the news for their wrongdoings. And the case of Sergei Torop isn't an exception. The original ideology of Torop's cult reportedly claimed Jesus Christ was watching over people from an orbit near Earth, adding that Virgin Mary was running Russia, according to Russian media reports. Over a decade after establishing his so-called religious organization, Torop spoke to news outlet The Guardian. The self-styled mystic was quoted as saying that what was promised 2,000 years ago has come to pass. He said he was Jesus Christ, the living word of God, the Father. Torop, however, stopped short of calling himself God, asserting that it would be a mistake to see Jesus as God, as reported by The Guardian. Instead, Torop pronounced himself to be the Vissarion, a Russian term for the one who gives new life. And the Vissarion rose to prominence on the cusp of the fall of Soviet Russia.
When people first united around the greatest physical strength, the era of the kingdom of force began, a time marked by the relationship between predator and prey. Over time, humans realized that achieving the greatest significance meant greater chances of survival and benefit. Without true spiritual values, people inevitably made it their main priority to assert their significance among others, interacting by the formula of predator and prey. This is how the consumer society was formed. No other type could arise on this foundation. Everything you see in life that brings suffering, trouble, or discomfort is directly related to these poisonous fruits. As long as you continue to value selfish priorities and fight for your own significance, dreaming of justice and universal prosperity will remain a naive and unrealistic wish under the current order. A new era. The kingdom of the soul will one day replace the current era of force. But do not confuse this with the hopes of some believers who expect to leave this world for endless bliss elsewhere.
As a communist state, the Soviet Union emphasized on secularism while enshrining freedom of conscience in its constitution. But as Nazi Germany's influence grew in Europe, the USSR eased religious restrictions to keep up a united front. However, it was not until the 1990 law on freedom of conscience in religious organizations that the Soviet Union witnessed a turnaround in the state's approach to religion. The new law allowed freedom of religion, separation of the church and the state, and most importantly, a legal status for religious organizations. Soon after, the USSR was dissolved, paving the way for present-day Russia and subsequently also for Sergei Torop's Vissarion cult.
Please tell me, should your followers study the theory and practice of management, for example, the sufficiently general theory of management of the internal predictor of the USSR or others? What general advice can you give on improving self-governance from the local level up to the state and planetary level for your followers living both in the settlements of the Promised Land and in the world, especially under the current circumstances? I have the impression that the answers to this question might also be of interest to benevolent representatives of extraterrestrial civilizations. A weighty question. I understand well the interest many have in finding the most effective forms of both governance and self-governance. Throughout your history, you have constantly encountered various complex consequences related to one form of governance or another. That is, in the system of managing society, you have always noticed what you considered imperfect or even harmful. This, in turn, naturally stimulated the search for a more perfect system. Even now, there are many who are actively reflecting on the possibility of creating such a system for managing all of society. In this topic, it is important to note first of all that the structure of all human society, with its various forms of governance that you observe today, has always had and continues to have the same essential character throughout history. Many details have changed, but these changes have not been fundamental. Note that I do not even consider the difference between a monarchy and a republic to be fundamental. The main essence of all known forms of governance is the necessity to force a person to do what he may not see as beneficial. Such management inevitably implies coercion, and thus fertile ground for the growth of lies and hatred. A society with such a characteristic system of governance could only have been formed by people possessing a certain type of inner qualities. These qualities naturally manifested in people from the beginning and continue to persist in everyone to this day, having undergone only minor changes so far. This means that as long as a person retains the old character of his emotional world, all attempts to change the system of governance will be cosmetic rather than fundamental. This is what has happened throughout human history. As long as a person's main life orientation and priority is to satisfy selfish interests, any union of people will always be unstable.
In 1991, following his spiritual awakening, the Vissarion announced the creation of his religious organization, or more aptly put, his own cult, called the Church of the Last Testament.
The question comes from a young inquisitive person named Peter, who is 11 years old. And the question is, how does the soul acquire a predestination at its first incarnation? A simple question, but in order to answer it, I have to touch in some more detail various nuances. As this subject is very serious and it is responsible for how your fate is being shaped, and moreover, it is intended to help you understand the purpose for which man has been born. In the final period of the soul's formation as an independent entity, two basic predestinations were laid down in it. One is designed to be responsible for the relationships, and the second is related to the general orientation responsible for the realization of the intent for which man's soul has been created. The soul of man did not develop the evolutionary way. It was created. And from here, the logical chain, if it was created purposefully, that means there's some meaning in this. It has been created for some purpose. This is the meaning which many people discuss and argue about, and it's really very important. To understand it is a vital necessity. And the meaning of birth has nothing to do with the traditional image that has been formed in man's life in the course of history. The soul's predestination should not be attributed to a certain individual peculiarity. That is, no man has an individual predestination. Therefore, there's no sense for you to try to find out what special mission you've been born for, what specifically you have to do.
Set up in a remote part of Siberia's Krasnoyarsk region, Torop's church claimed to take principles aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church and combine them with the religion of Buddhism, as well as ideals from apocalypticism, collectivism, and ecological values. Since its establishment, Torop's church drew several followers, who reportedly flocked to set up an abode in something called the Sun City, 3,700 kilometers south of Russia's capital Moscow. Over the years, the cult's disciples multiplied into thousands, spread across Russia and the world. The Christian-style religious order was ruled by a strict set of principles, particularly the abstention from any vice, the compulsory need to follow veganism with few exceptions, no animal husbandry or monetary exchange within the cult. When admirers arrived in the Sun City, they were purportedly told to hand over all their money, leaving them with no way to return to their old lives. The Vissarion believers even began to follow a new calendar, reported The Guardian. The new calendar counted years starting from 1961, when Sergei Torop was born, and Christmas was soon replaced by celebrations on the 14th of January, Torop's birthday. The Vissarion even penned down his rulings and principles in 18 volumes called the Last Testament. Vissarion's cult drew condemnation from the Russian Orthodox Church, with its leaders believing he should have been stopped. But the Russian state largely left Torop and his disciples to their own, at least until 2020. 3 decades after the advent of his cult, the Vissarion faced his first legal hurdle. Torop's order discouraging his followers from using money came back to haunt him. An investigation led by Russia's FSB found that the Vissarion, under the garb of his religious cult, allegedly extorted money from his followers and subjected them to psychological abuse between 1991 and 2020. The accusation followed a dramatic operation in which helicopter-esque and armed officers arrived at the Vissarion's secluded commune to arrest the Vissarion and 2 of his aides. The trio was accused of creating a religious group whose activities may impose violence on citizens. However, all 3 denied the allegations. 5 years after his arrest, on June 30th, a Russian court sentenced Torop to 12 years in prison for allegedly harming the mental and physical health of his followers. One of his associates, Vadim Redkin, was sentenced to 11 years in prison, while another, Vladimir Vedyornikov, faced 12 years of jail time. But it was unclear if the 3 men would appeal their sentences. According to prosecutors, Torop's actions caused 16 individuals moral harm, causing serious health problems to at least 6 of them. As compensation for the victims, the court ordered the accused to pay a fine of about 40 million rubles. The clampdown on Torop was seen as part of a larger effort by the Russian state to curb the growing influence of any group, religious or otherwise, within the country. With his sentence, it now remains unclear what the future holds for Torop's disciples and his remote religious commune in Russia.